Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Bunka-cho Art Platform Japan Symposium, the globalization of the art world in Japan, what lies ahead for the advancement of contemporary art. This symposium is provided with simultaneous interpretation between Japanese and English. Please look at the YouTube channel details to confirm the language details. And if you have any questions, please use the chat function. As far as time permits, we would like to pick up your questions towards the latter part of this program. We look forward to having a lot of questions. And also, we will be providing archive footage, an archive version rather, of the symposium on the same channel after the live stream is over. Please refrain, however, from making any recording of any kind or capturing any images from the symposium. We would now like to formally begin the Bunka-cho Art Platform Symposium, the globalization of the art world in Japan, what lies ahead for the advancement of contemporary art. Before we begin, we would like to call upon the Director General of the National Art Center Tokyo, Osaka Eriko, to say a few words. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Bunka-cho Art Platform Symposium. The title is The Globalization of the Art World and Japan, what lies ahead for the advancement of contemporary art. Since last year, the COVID-19 pandemic has made it very difficult to have interaction between people. And this online version of the symposium will make it possible to connect people from far away. And we are fortunate in that we've had a very good response. And we will be able to showcase individuals who are directly involved with the art platform activities and also two artists, Mori Yuko and Yamashiro Chikako. And we will have an opportunity to have frank and open exchange of views and ideas. It will be a lengthy session until the 4 o'clock, but we look forward to having some very interesting points, which I am sure will surface in discussion. We hope that you'll be able to stay with us to the end. Thank you very much indeed, President, Director General Osaka. We would now like to call upon Hirayama Naoko, Director of the Planning and Coordination Division of the Agency for Cultural Affairs. Thank you very much indeed. I'd like to take 15 minutes to explain about the Agency for Cultural Affairs, the Bunka-cho overall policy package and the basic direction. For the next fiscal year, we will be basically shifting our functions to Kyoto. And when that decision was made, it happened to coincide with the time when the overall cultural economic strategy was pulled together under the auspices of the Prime Minister's office. So it was not just the Agency for Cultural Affairs. Part of the strategy was to look at the creation of new demand and also new value added, and art was part of what fell within its scope. Previously, the Agency for Cultural Affairs had been focusing on the establishment of various national museums, and we also have the Tokyo and Kyoto National Museums, which basically focus on Oriental historical art. So while it is described as a Hakubutsukan, which implies more of antiquities, it is an art museum. when you look at the general direction of the museums which have been established by the Bunka-cho, the Agency for Cultural Affairs, in the post-war era. And we also look at supporting exhibitions, providing opportunities with, for example, public or open competitions to show and to share their work. This basic direction can be exemplified by the creation of the National Arts Center where you are today. And this was actually identified as a place which could provide a setting for the blockbuster exhibitions, which have the organization of newspapers behind them, and also the exhibitions which are held as a result of public competitions and open calls. Now, looking back at the Koizumi administration, there was a very fierce debate over whether museums should be supported by the national government or whether they should be the private sector. But we have continued to argue for the importance of having national museums. However, the basic situation has shifted to where the national museums have become independent public bodies, but the evaluation criteria has shifted towards looking at the numbers of how many visitors came and how much money was generated through ticket sales, for example, which is slightly different, or rather quite different, from what the basis of arts support is all about. And we feel quite strongly that we need to go back to the basics and to where the starting point. A lot of people have said that the Japanese only throw money at the buildings and don't think about what goes inside the buildings. But the idea is really identifying the importance of opening up new horizons. And basic straight direction is what you can see here in the larger letters, which is about a virtuous circle between the arts and culture and economy. New capitalism is being posited by the current administration, but I sense is that arts and culture will become very important as we think about the future. The Japanese have been known for the technical skill, but a lot of what human activity has been about will be replaced by artificial intelligence and robots. And if that's the case, then looking at what only humans can do will be an important direction for confirming Japan's position in the world. And so, in addition to showing art through exhibitions, it's really important to look at whether we are sending out proper messages to the world and whether we are contributing to the creation of new values. And that is how we'd like to create new policies. There are 5 national museums across the country, and compared to the great museums of the West, the United States or Europe, I think that Director Osaka is quite familiar with the usual debate over budgets. But in the case of Japan, the tendency seems to be diverse, highly individualized individual players coexisting, which seems to be a tendency not just in the arts, but also in Japanese society as a whole. For example, looking at car manufacturers or electrical appliance manufacturers, there's a tremendously large number of those companies. But when they all come together, though this actual scale of companies might be rather small, they have the incredible ability to pull their weight. And it's not just about the Japanese audience, it's also a matter of how much international attention is focused upon the work that is being done here through exhibition making, also how much information is being shared properly through English, and how much we are going to be able to disseminate through the art scene. We look at this both in the context of the historical museums and also the art museums. And the national historical museums actually have been pushed into the direction of some fundamental changes, looking at how tourism can be an integral part of their operations. They have 5 different languages that they have to use for displays. And in the past, the national historical museums used to be basically very quiet and deserted. However, before the pandemic, they became very attractive places for the tourists to visit. So looking at this, the important thing is how much we're going to be able to focus our attention and our power upon the task of channeling our energies towards the newly created art, contemporary art. So that's how the Bunka-cho art platform has been developed. It began as a very small-scale, modest activity, but by growing this in a major way, we are going to be able to create new cultural policy. And we hope that the participants in this activity will be able to lead the art scene. So now I'd like to look at some of the data. Looking at the Japanese market, it's basically tiny. During the bubble years, up to around 1991, Japanese art buyers were making headlines around the world. But now we have a completely different situation. And if you could look at the next page, please. This is the Japanese art market. As you are very familiar, the Japanese audience, of course, knows that in the Japanese art market, the department stores and the newspapers are major players. Whether it's a good or bad thing, leaving that discussion aside, ever since modernization began in the major restoration, the department stores and the newspapers were important drivers of the arts, which is a very distinctly Japanese way to do things. But how we can continue to respect that and also develop it further is another issue that we need to face. And looking at the players surrounding art, the government, national and local, basically focused on creating museums and doing exhibitions there. But recently, the arts festivals, particularly in the regions, have become a very important part of art activity. However, they are linked to regeneration of the regions. But looking at the situation from the global perspective, many of them do not have that much fame or much of a reputation outside of Japan. So we have continued to provide funds and grants. But looking at the future, when we think about how we can promote the arts, we hope to be able to link up forces with all the players who are involved in this constellation, and we need to be able to create policies and build policies, because so much of what needs to be done cannot be done by our agency. We are only supporting you. We can provide you with the infrastructure. However, the private sector, the main players, need to be creating a momentum, and our important role is to be able to provide the backup to continue to encourage you and to make it possible to support you. So we'd like to take a broad-based perspective regarding how we can support the arts in general, not just limiting ourselves to the museums. As for the regional arts festivals, many of them are literary festivals, but at the same time they are very high quality and very high caliber. But compared to the Biennale and Triennale, which are being involved, for example, which are famous internationally, they are not that well known. And part of that, I think, is similar to the situation with Japanese art museums or Japanese historical museums. If you do a Van Gogh or a Vermeer exhibition, then you have a turnout which can go touch the millions, but it's about connecting to the future, about how we can boost our global appeal and our ability to reach out and to send out messages. And while all these are important, our sense is that you need to emphasize different aspects.
And looking at the art fairs, there are very many excellent Japanese artists and also galleries which are renowned not just in Japan but also outside of Japan. And they have been represented in the various art fairs. 2 days ago, we saw the finals of the Chopin piano competition where we had two Japanese pianists win prizes, or in ballet competitions, for example, we have seen individuals scoring very high in these competitions. So we would like to see how these artists may be able to work here in Japan, for them to have their activities not just abroad but also in Japan, and that is one thing we would like to support. Looking at art fairs, there are many people who attend such art fairs from all over the world. And these are art fairs which need to have some sort of support. Of course, we from the national government have done some support. We would like to support not only those artists going abroad for these art fairs, but we would also like to see how we can extend that to such art fairs which could be held in Japan as well. And if you look at this diagram, we are looking at the result of a working group from the Cultural Promotion Council, and we're looking at the art fairs and how we will be able to promote these art fairs. That had been the role of the government, and we show that the general public or the artists have not really taken place in that. Now, from the Edo era, we have seen a lot of art or artistic elements even in the general households in Japan. But with the introduction of Western art, we tended to shift more towards viewing such important art. But there had not been a practice in Japan of having such artworks displayed in the individual homes. But it is true that there are many Japanese who are collectors as well. However, the number or absolute number of such collectors may be very small in comparison to what you would see in the European nations or the United States. And there's also the issue of these collectors not being also able to donate some of their works or lease their works of art to museums. There's one problem on the museum side that they do not have sufficient space for displaying such works of art. But there's also a problem of not being the system not being there, which will allow the collectors to share their artworks with museums. And the reason for that being that we have all different players which are disparate and they are not really linked together. So what's needed is to have a better connection or better links amongst the players. Looking at the curators at the bottom, and in case of very large major exhibits, we have to rely on the capabilities and powers of the mass media to promote such major exhibitions. But it is true that museums also need to play a role in that. Because the museums themselves should be able to create new values for their uh, venues, and then they should be able to compete with the newspaper companies, for example, in winning over such exhibitions. We know that in Japan, the curators are very busy on not being able to dedicate their time for organizing these major exhibitions. But if we would look at all the different sizes and different types of museums, there is a very large amount of collections that can be shared by all of these museums, and we should be able to capture such assets on the national level. And while there are art fairs held here, there are, in most cases, very small in scale. So we do not have a place in Japan where all people engaged in the art business could come together. There's no such large venue that can be made available for such art fair. We need to see how we can strengthen the functionality of national museums. We have what is called the Art Communication Center, which is to be established. And we have over 10 billion yen of a budget for this art communication center to be established. And we will be able to have a good grasp of the cultural assets that are held by the museum. And they will also be able to continue with their business of creating such international network. And there also will be a need for creating what you might call the national collections. And they also need to work in educating and nurturing curators. So we believe that those are some of the most important things or functions that need to be played by the national museums. And for the vitalization of the art area, we also like to play a supporting role from the background to encourage the creations of such art fairs. And what is called the Art Week Tokyo is to be held this year, and we hope that we will have a place or venue in Japan where we could have all those people related to the art business gather here in Japan for such an event in the future. And I have just quickly gone through my presentation as to the role of the government. Today, we will be able to listen to some of the curators who have been spearheading the promotion of art here in Japan to listen to their views. There's very little that we, as the agency, can do. But we would like to continue in the steps that we have been taking. But we would also like to expand it further, not just to promote the exhibitions to be held, but to play more role, changing the direction of what Bunka-cho or the cultural agency has been playing. And we have seen an endeavor to review the reorganization of the Arts Council, and we at the Bunka-cho Ministry will try to create a new trend or new direction towards that. We hope that we will not be far behind the public sector in placing art in the center of the Japanese government's policies. And we look to you for your cooperation and your support. Thank you very much, and I'm sorry for having gone through very quickly through my presentation. Thank you, Ms. Hirayama. And next, we would like to listen to Ms. Kataoka about the art platform.
And Dr. Kataoka is also been active as the chair of the Contemporary Art Committee Japan, and she's been primary player in the art platform. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. And as Dr. Hirayama has mentioned in her presentation, the contemporary art situation around the world has basically experienced very sudden and rapid globalization since the 1990s, so in the past 30 years. This direction has begun from 30 years ago, and it has been a shift away from the traditional Eurocentric creation of art being received and accepted by the other countries. But now we have galleries, art fairs, and also the Biennale, Triennale, auctions, all of those, together with the museums, having interaction and relations. So contemporary art is being created simultaneously around the world as a global phenomenon. And looking at the Asian region, there are the rapidly developing countries such as China, India, and Southeast Asia, which have continued to attract a great deal of attention from around the world, and the newly rich have driven the creation of new contemporary art markets. Looking at the International Triennale and Biennale, for example, there's the 1995 creation of the Gwangju Biennale in Korea. There's also Busan, Seoul, Taipei, Taichung, Bangkok, Jakarta, Yogyakarta, Singapore, and Kochi in India. While Gwangju is considered to be the oldest in Asia, there are many such examples just in Asia. And in Japan, there is Echigo Tsumari, Yokohama, Setouchi, and Aichi as the large-scale arts festivals. Now, looking at the Venice Biennale, Japan has been a participant from 1952 onwards. And from the 1990s onwards, the countries around Asia have become to step up their participation with the creation of their own national pavilions. Now, how contemporary, or rather contemporary modern art has developed has become a topic for comparative studies, and in that context, Japanese post-war art has also attracted a great deal of attention. And there are many artists who have become internationally renowned, who have originated from Japan. However, when we look at this from the framework of contemporary art in Japan, how it is seen and how it is regarded is the topic for discussion today. And as I mentioned earlier, now that the contemporary art market around the world has grown, almost become bloated, and almost saturated, achieved saturation point, now that there are so many, there's almost a glut of art fairs and also Biennale, Triennale, and art museums. If Japan continues the policies it was implementing 30 years ago, then its presence will become diluted in relative terms, globally speaking. Also, the past 30 years have been a period when the countries around Asia have experienced rapid economic growth. However, Japan experienced the collapse of the economic bubble of the late 1980s, and entered a period of economic slowdown and shrinking. which is also overlapped with this growth of the neighbors. So the fact that Japanese contemporary art has become less obvious and less attracting attention gathering is a fact. However, in 2014, the Bunka-cho established a discussion group for disseminating knowledge about contemporary art abroad around the world. And they also put out a report. This report is extremely interesting, and many topics and issues have been identified there. And from that, I'd like to draw attention to this slide. The basic overarching objective is to create a system which will support the sustainable and the continued development of art, the arts rather, in this country. But before that, there is a need to create the foundations for these activities, looking at the art fairs, also the Biennale and Triennale. We have those events, but it's very difficult to go the further step and to go beyond that. So the art platform has identified a number of sub-objectives, while continuing to focus the most attention on the fulfillment of infrastructure relating to art and also continued or sustained maximization. So creating visible networks with abroad is important, but you need to have a personal connection, otherwise it's very difficult to go into actual results. So being able to create a network or network that allows you to identify the individuals as faces and as actual people. And we also were aware of the importance of creating a website that would allow us to become a portal for sharing information abroad. So we want to strengthen that ability. We also were very much aware of the fact there was no database which provided a one-stop access to the collections held by national museums. And what information was available was only in Japanese, so we needed to put that into English. So we wanted to create that integrated system. Also, there was a need for the translation of texts. So we needed to provide English translation of important texts in this field and to share them abroad. Actually visible results may not be evident right now. However, this is a midpoint report, as it were, so I'd like to share some of the information we have as a work in progress. So in order to create an international network of art professionals, in 2018 and 2019, we organized these workshops, which were invitation-based, and we had 3 days of intensive discussions. So the discussions also made it possible to create personal connections and networks. This gives you a list of the participants, 2018, 2019, and these are the people who are in positions to actually create the concept for exhibitions in each of their institutions. We planned to do an edition last year, but because of the COVID-19 pandemic, we had to put that into hiatus. However, in order to replace that, as a way of making up for that, rather, we had this webinar series, Contemporary Art After the Coronavirus and Its Ecology. So we had a series of webinars which were held in that context. This gives you the summary. with contemporary art, how to continue the exchange, and then there was the issue of how contemporary art was going to be shown. Also, whether there's going to be any change in the way in which we make exhibitions. Also, whether art itself was going to undergo any transformation. And we also looked at the possibility of a new take of contemporary art. And we also have created this website. There was a tremendous amount of discussion. We have releases on the 15th of March, and it's called Art Platform Japan. So you can see this. And it's basically a place to look at resources, also to showcase the workshops. And we have this infrastructure, which is the website, which already is up and running. The third pillar of activity was translation of key texts. In order to enhance our international how we appreciate internationally, we have a team for translation, and they have these themes that they're looking at. They've also translated these books, and there's a starting point for how they're carrying out their activities. The Anarchy of the Body and Histories of Modern and Contemporary Japan through Art. We also are sharing these results via the website. And you can already access all the major texts which have been translated. We also are creating this cross-referenceable database of artworks in museums in Japan. It's called Shuzo. Shuzo is the sound for the Japanese word for collected works. And we also provide this in both English and Japanese. We'll have an opportunity to introduce that properly afterwards, I think. And the same for this. Other projects introduced include contemporary Japanese art exhibitions research. This has been done by Nakajima Masatoshi and Kyoko Matsuyama Wudoiak. We also have been conducting research on Japanese art galleries from 1945 onwards. Other activities, we provide support to artists who are participating in International Triennale and Biennale. The thing is that in order for Japanese artists to take part in these international Biennale and Triennale, we need to invite the curator to come to do research. We also need to provide some additional support, because what support is extended by the actual International Biennale is always limited. So Katayama Mari and Takata-san, Ikeda Ryoji, a total of 4 artists were supported through this mechanism for the Venice Biennale 2 years ago. And Mori-san and Yamashiro-san, who will be speaking after me, are being supported for this fiscal year, and we'd like to have them talk about their own work. So we'd now like to go into session 2, starting with Mori Yuko.
Thank you very much for the introduction. My name is Mori Yuko. As just introduced, I was able to take part in the São Paulo Biennale, and I received support which allowed me to exhibit at the Biennale. I don't have much time to go over the shows, but I would like to give you some idea of how I was able to take part in the Biennale in the the COVID pandemic. Here you will be able to see this photo. This is the hall that is used, or the pavilion that is used for the Biennale. Its architect is Hirayama, and this had been used, or this venue has been used since the first Sao Paulo Biennale, and it was just before the pandemic began at the end of February. And I have been very fortunate to spend only 2 days, but actually go to this venue where it has a very abundant amount of natural lighting. And so I was able to research the venue ahead of time. When I create my installations, they are sound installations or kinetic installations, whereby I would put together some items which you find in your daily lives, and they are used for my installations. And it is not that these items, objects, complete my installation, but I also make use of the environment in which they are placed. For example, the natural light that comes through, any sound, noise that comes through, and I also try to involve any regional distinctiveness of the venue into my work of art. So when I went there for my research, this was my first visit to Brazil. I was able to take in the environment, and also this venue very futuristic in its architectural design. I found that the painting on the walls were very interesting, or any of the sound effects, acoustics of the hall was also interesting for me. However, because of the COVID-19 pandemic, the Biennale was to be delayed by 1 year to this year. And in October of last year, the curator informed me that the Biennale would be postponed. However, he told me that they would like to conduct a pre-event by just the Brazilian staff. It was titled Vento, which means the wind in Portuguese. Now, ordinarily, if they had a Biennale, they will have dividers or walls established, and partitions, walls, but they decided that they will hold this pre-event in this open space, and so they were going to invite a few artists to exhibit in the pavilion. When I was informed of this, this would have been my very first time where I was not going to be able to attend the installation at the venue. And this is a photograph showing what the exhibit looked like. You see that it is almost empty, but you see a speaker hanging from the top, 80 meters from the speakers, or there are 80 meters between the speakers. And I try to capture any resonance or echo that is captured. And my work was titled I Can't Hear You. And during the pandemic, I spent a lot of time watching YouTube and Netflix, and I saw Suzuki Daisetsu's program. And at that time, Suzuki Daisetsu, this was from the very late years of his life, and this was her program which visited people who had known Deity Suzuki. And at that time, they were speaking using international calls, so telephone, to speak. And they saw that while Suzuki was speaking fluently in English, people who found that at that time they did not have a very good quality of communication with these international calls. And so he kept repeating, I can't hear you very well because of the poor communication technology. Today, with Zoom available and the internet being used for communication, I do feel a lot of frustration when I am not able to connect well. And so that means that while I had to put together my installation remotely, I also felt that frustration. And I look back to what D.T. Suzuki had said as to why he couldn't hear you. And what I tried to do was that the sound in one area of the venue was very clear, but in some other areas it will be quite blurred. And this is just a part of the installation. And here you see the Biennale, which started on in September, going on until December. And this is the installation. It's dark. And if you look at the next one, we use these three sound sculptures for my installation. And they have on different or separate platforms on which they are placed. But what they do is to see that all these items or objects are synchronized using radio wave. And this is also how I can't hear you. And while I could only work remotely, I decided to put together this new installation. We can communicate with Zoom or the internet, but we have cases when we are not able to hear each other very well. So this stems from the fact that we have difficulty in communication. And we have a performance theme called Zumgine. And this is a group of women artists who would try to express the sound of rain, for example, using their voices. And that was used for this. Maybe the sound of people who are coughing, or I also use Suzuki's voice of I can't hear you. And these were the sounds used and synchronized using the radio wave. And all these sounds would blend together, or they would be distorted because of that combination. And that would express the difficulty that I had been experiencing in communicating with people. And during the COVID-19 pandemic, I think we had then been trying to fight against this unseen virus, and I think this is the reason why I try to express my thoughts using such installation. Thank you.
And we now like to call upon Yamashiro Chikako. Thank you. I had the opportunity to take part in the 11th Seoul Media Biennale. The overall title was One Escape at a Time, and it was supposed to have been held in 2020. However, it was postponed until this autumn. It actually opened on September the 8th and continues until the 21st of November. It's very large scale as a Biennale, and there are 41 artists, 50 pieces are being shown, and I have a video work which is shown as an installation, and the theme the overall theme is really about escaping from reality, escaping from your current circumstances, but with the impact of the pandemic and the postponement of the schedule means that the theme of escaping from reality or trying to ignore reality is being taken in this overall theme. Shinbin Western, A Portrait of a Family, is what I've shown, and this is part of a contemporary art exhibition which was shown at the National Museum of Art Osaka in 2019. But actually, I happened to be pregnant, and I started to shoot this when I was 3 months pregnant. And as my pregnancy continued, I was also getting deeper into the filming and also the editing process, to the point where it's no longer allowed to board a plane to get from Okinawa, where I live. So this was actually a work which is completed via telecommunications. So this was a remote process, and this is a piece which has actually been packaged. So I thought it was appropriate for the Seoul Media City Biennale, considering the circumstances. However, when it came to the actual installing, the Seoul Media City Biennale was not just postponed, there was also a slashing of the budget, I understand. So how to show this work in a way which was adapted to the situation was directly impacted by the changes to the equipment. Because when you have media work, the equipment that you can use actually does have a major influence on the quality. And we had shot this using 4K technology, so we wanted to maintain this. However, 5.1 channels, installation, specifications actually became rather difficult for the Seoul team to achieve. So we tried to push down the costs, but the artistic director, Young-ma, and Young-ma's engineer team were fantastic, because they were able to find a way to maintain the quality while achieving the objectives of bringing down the overall costs. All this was very difficult, so we ended up having 2 Zoom meetings with my regular sound engineer and video engineer taking part in discussion. So the engineers got on with their technical details, which is far beyond my comprehension as an artist. And I think that with the shrinking of the budget, there was always the possibility, hypothetically, that I would have not been invited to take part in the postponed edition. But I was able to take part in this, and I'm very, very grateful for that opportunity and for the fact that I've been able to continue to be a part of this. And one more, please. It wasn't just a matter of the equipment. This work was shown with a single screen. It's a narrative, almost cinematic, and the original showing in the National Museum of Art Osaka had curtains which would open, reveal, the screen and then have the actual play film itself, and then the curtains would close and the lights would be set, come on, back on, and there would be the sound of horse hooves. However, it was also very important to maintain the sound quality as a sound installation. There were two barrels which would actually provide sound directly from right next to the audience, but we had to give up those ideas, so we had to abandon the idea of using that speaker because of various considerations. And I think that's enough from me. Thank you very much indeed, Yamashiro-san. And we would now like to go into the panel discussion. So could the participants please come to the front? Yamashiro-san, Mori-san, please stay as you are. Thank you very much indeed. We would now like to begin the panel discussion. If you have any questions, please use the chat function on the live stream channel page. And I'd like to introduce the participants in the panel. Uematsu Yuko, Chief Curator of the National Museum of Art, Osaka. Kazuya Kenji, Professor at the University of Tokyo. Nariai Hajime, Curator at the National Museum of Modern Art, Tokyo. Kawaguchi Masako, Head of the Research Library, National Museum of Western Art. Oda Natsuko, Arts Commons, Tokyo, and Yoshiko Ishiki Office. Mori, Yuko, and Yamashiro, Chikako, artists. And also the moderator is going to be Kataoka Mami. Thank you. And I spoke about the art platform, and we have the individual work groups, and I'd like to have the people who've been involved in the working groups to speak about the details. First of all, a number of workshops were devised by Uematsu-san, and I'd like to ask Uematsu-san to speak about this. 2018, 2019. 2019 was held in Osaka, and the plans are to have the workshop in January of this year. Could you look back at the results and the achievements? Thank you.
Thank you for your explanation. We had two workshops held in Tokyo and Osaka. And we had people who are not just from Japan, but also from outside of Japan. We established different topics or themes for each of the workshops. And as a result of these workshops, well, I cannot say that there had been something that's tangible coming out of the workshop. However, curators who had listened to the workshops, we had seen that there had been some collaboration between them and artists for some projects. Or we had a joint project with the Singapore Museum, and this was spearheaded by a curator from Hong Kong who had been part of the workshop on the very first workshop. So I believe that through the workshop, we were able to introduce some of the works by the Japanese artists in Hong Kong. Unfortunately, due to the pandemic, we were not able to have many people attend these workshops. And we were hoping that we would have been able to do this as part of the Basel Hong Kong. However, there were still possibilities that they could have taken place. So these are some of the things that came out of these workshops. And for this fiscal year, we are planning to have this in Fukuoka. This had been planned for Fukuoka last year, but due to the pandemic impact, we have had to postpone this to this fiscal year. And we're hoping that this will be held in January of next year. And ordinarily, we would have people who are from abroad, and we don't know whether we will be able to realize that. However, we would at least like to have the Japanese members take part in the workshop at the museum in Fukuoka. And we will be looking at East Asia and Japan, or art between the East Asian regions and Japan. And we'll also be looking at limitation placed on holding exhibit during this pandemic, because it is very difficult to transport the works of art in such an environment. And we will be discussing some case studies as to what could be done through these difficult times. The art platform project is a 5-year-long project. And in the end, we hope that we'll be able to put together some sort of a project or plan at the end of the 5-year period between the Japanese and overseas attendees. But first of all, because of the limitations, we would like to see how we will be able to do this in Fukuoka amongst the members of the Japanese people, and then see how we could then extend this further. Yeah, I think in the workshop we have some people who had been repeat visitors or attendees in the workshops, so that we want to make this very visible to each other. And why do we need such a network where the people are visible to each other? Well, in this environment of the COVID pandemic, we are using the PCs, using Zoom, and have online meetings. I'm sure everyone has taken part in such meetings. However, when we want to create a network where we are visible to each other, I think that allows us to have that sense of trust established and built amongst the attendees. We have tried to conduct research using this network, and it has really taken place as well. So I think it's important that we create such a network. It's not to say that we did not have such a network, but it used to be that these tended to be very networks on a very personal level. But the fact that we have this body or this organization as formulating the network has been a very important thing. The next thing I'd like to ask is Mr. Kajiya. I know that you are involved very much in translations. In 2015, at the MoMA in New York, there was an exhibit where he had put together, there had been an anthology of post-war Japanese art. And Mr. Kajiya had been involved in that project as well. And I think in the past 10 years or so, there's a lot of interest increasing on Japanese art. And I'd like you to speak about your experience in working on the translations. I know that there are a lot of Japanese books, volume 6, and I'd like to know how much of that is actually being translated into English. Well, first of all, as Ms. Kataoka mentioned, in 1990 or so, where there had been a growing interest in Japanese post-war art, there had been there had been a book called Screen Against the Sky, which had been translated into English.
And after the situation began to change, and from the around 2010 onwards, there was renewed interest in Japanese art, and with exhibitions being held, it meant that the non-European and a situation which is not classifiable as white Caucasian male became the context for discussing and thinking about Japanese art and how it can be possible to think about this kind of art and what alternatives exist is become very important. You mentioned the exhibition at New York MoMA about post-war Japanese art, but the MoMA has already been looking at Asian art, also about the Middle East, not just about Japan, which are areas and regions which are not that emphasized traditionally by MoMA. They have been looking at the translation of texts, critical texts about criticism from those areas, and about 80% or so of that text that is being provided by MoMA has been translated by our group. I think we've done about 10. Also, 2006, there's been translation of texts on photography. However, the overall situation is still very much limited in the actual quantity of what is being translated. And a lot of the really famous, familiar names have remained untouched. Because if you think about really famous pieces, they run into the hundreds. And if we just say that Japan doing the translation is going to be enough, then we run into a quandary because Japan is being, people are showing interest in Japan because it is different from the traditional mainstream. But if we just show the male perspective, then of course we're going to be having some problems, and the art platform translation is trying to look at the alternatives. How many texts are you translating right now, and could you talk about your future plans? Well, we have more than 30 which we plan to work on. 16 have already been released. We're pushing ahead with about 20 different texts, and we hope to be able to select a total of about 100 titles to be translated by the end of this fiscal year, and we'd like to continue to share our finished translations. Also, what is important is that when you have the bilingual catalogs for exhibitions, we need to get permission to release the English texts, and we have about 80 of those examples which are already being shared. There's also the issue of how we have the representation, because Japanese tend to be rather vague about whether something is singular or plural, or the Japanese way tendency to end sentences in a rather vague way by saying, "Is that not true?" We also are in the process of putting together a style guide. Oh, sorry, we've already released this. This is a style guide, which is a lot of people who've been working on the actual translation say is fantastic. Also, I should note that we are not just doing the translation from Japanese to English. We also have fact checkers. We also have editors. So it's not just translation. We have very thorough backup to do the translation properly. Thank you. We hope that you'll look at the actual website. We now like to call upon Nariai-san. Hajime. is working on the bilingual database of collection holdings within Japan, and we're going to have a demonstration. So we'd just like to share the screen. This is the website. It's called Shuzo, and I've been working on this.
So let's see what sort of data we can find from Ms. Yamashiro. And we see several Yamashiros, and we also find information about Ms. Yamashiro's Chikako. His listing of the work that she has created, and they're all shown bilingually in Japanese and English. And we also have a very detailed account of the artists themselves. This is Yamashiro's page. And it's possible to search for many different artists. And so you can go through this, and then we find Miss Mori, Mori Yuko. And we are trying to enrich the data that we have for all the artists. And this will accompany information about the public collection of the artist's work. And we are also trying to put together some information about certain artists. Now, Yasui Sotaro, the Chinese characters that he used for his name. Then there are several variations for the character he used, but we make sure that regardless of which character is being used, that we'll be able to search and actually retrieve information on such artists. And I know that it's been a very complicated process that you've had to follow in order to put together this search engine. And right now you have no any visual data that's included in the Shuzo. But what are your future plans, and what sort of issues do you see? Now, if I go into the details of the background, if I'll just put them in a few words. And so what was public need to be made public is what we're trying to do. In other words, what's something that's public, it should be self-explanatory, that can be made available. With Shuzo, we do make public some of the information about collections held by museums. Some museums only have the catalog on paper, or they may not have the large enough scale where they are able to publish their collections. So what we tried to do was to gather all of them into a single database. Now, the Bunka-cho, the Agency for Cultural Affairs, had also attempted to create such database, but people have had to follow a certain format in entering the data. However, what we did was to ask the museums to send us the catalogs data that they have. We just asked them to send them to us, and we took on the work of entering the data into Shuzo. So currently we have 190,000 items which are covered by this database, which is already the largest database. We have information from over 100 museums, and we have 1,242 artists included in our database, and we will be adding on more and more data to this database. As Ms. Kataoka mentioned, we do not have any visual data in our database. And of course, that had been the request from the beginning, that we should have the graphics covered as well. But it is the negotiation that we need to conduct as to their the rights of ownership, rights of exhibition of such graphic or visual data. And some other issues that we have is that we have to get a much broader and wider coverage in the future. The current plan is to limit this to Japanese artists from Meiji era onwards, but we want to see how that can be expanded to include not just Japanese, but also those artists are overseas, and we hope that we'll be able to capture all the museums in Japan in the future. And we need that people actually use such database. It is already open, and I'd like to ask all of you to make use of this. And we have pages for you to enter your suggestions. And so we'd like to invite everyone to utilize this database and give us feedback. Next, I'd like to ask Ms. Kawaguchi Masako. I know that you have also taken part in creation of databases, and I know that the Art Documentation Academy has conducted a very interesting symposium in the searching of collections. And you have, what is the relationship between the existing collection databases and Shuzo? Well, I'd like to use these slides to explain that to you. As was just explained, there had been an endeavor also led by the cultural agency, which is called Bunka-cho Online, for capturing the data from the different museums in Japan. And we have a Japan Search. This covers not only museums but also other facilities such as libraries. And so Japan Search is to gather information, and we call them aggregators. And you might already know that Japan Search is not connected directly, but Japan Search will go by a certain cluster or a group of institutions. And this mechanism made it difficult for museums to also become a part of Japan Search. And what we are trying to do here to utilize Japan Search from the National Conference of Museums, there are certain data that can connect directly to Japan Search, but there are also some which have not been digitized or which cannot easily connect digitally. And so that's the reason why Art Platform Japan has put together Shuzo. And in case of Shuzo, we are saying that anything that's on paper can also be entered into Shuzo if they would send that to Shuzo. And anything that's already published and as electronic data that can also be joined together. So Shuzo has been in existence for about 6 months now, and I know that all sorts of data are being digitized, and there are also many overseas museums which have this type of search engines. But what is the direction of a Shuzo that you are looking to? So currently we just started this attempt, and so it's just museum information, the works, and some English language data, and also information about the artists. And I know that this is going to then be expanded further. And what we are looking to do in the near future is to also gather information about the different galleries in Japan and also from the different exhibits which have taken place in Japan. And so we also need something that will make access to such data. Now, they are already available in forms of books or volumes, but we want to include such information as data. And so we are trying to improve the state of making such data available, which had not been readily reachable or searchable. And what's important is that what's already taking place outside of Japan is far advanced, far more advanced compared to what we have here. And something that we are not able to view from the outside is that we have a foundation for making the search. So first of all, any data on paper will need to be digitized first before they could become a part of a database. So we need that circulation of data which will be meaningful for the outside world to also use. So we need to establish a good foundation for Shuzo. And I'd like to pass on to Ms. Odate.
And Odate-san, you've been a manager for artists, which you continue to do. You've also been providing backup for the workshops and the presentations made by artists. When you link together the artists and international curators and researchers, what is the most important thing that you can do, and what is the most effective way in which you can provide that connection? Well, Hirayama-san said in her presentation that she wanted to make Japan into a sort of place where artists would gather together. And I am often supporting artists when they are creating their work. And it's very rare for artists to work on their own. There are many, many different collaborators, including curators and gallerists. But it's very much a collaborative process, and a very important aspect of the work is research. In that situation, the websites, materials and resources, having a dependable source of that which continues to be updated is very important. So this being a continued initiative, even after the project itself might come to an end, is, I think, very important, and it's also very important to have this done by Japan. Also, making this Japan a place where artists will congregate is not just about Japanese artists. I think it also, I assume it's probably going to be referring to international artists as well. So how we can do that approach and how we can focus our energies on that is very important. So having a mechanism or a place which can act as the receiving end where research is going to be conducted, and also which can provide them with support when necessary, regardless of whether we're talking about Japanese or international artists, for contemporary art to develop and to continue to grow, we need to have artists and, of course, the work that they make. So providing a foundation, the fundamentals for their activities is very important. The Agency for Cultural Affairs have done that. And providing support for artists, particularly when they create the art, and sustaining that effort is very important, I think. Thank you. Mori-san, Yamashiro-san, you have given your presentations as artists, and we supported you for this fiscal year as part of this project, which is very ambitious, as you can see, and taking part in those international biennale. My guess is that you have a tremendous diversity of artists who have been supported in many different ways. Could you share some of your thoughts about that and what you might have experienced? Also, the amount that we provided you with is very limited, but could you help us understand more about where you definitely would like to see more support and what kind of support you would like to see experience? Thank you. I've been listening to your comments with great interest. The creation of the archive, the translation project, all those are extremely encouraging. And unfortunately, for this year, we were not able to really interact with other artists, so we couldn't actually do that, which I think is something that I do wish could have been different. But before the pandemic, we would have discussions or just chat about how you arrived at this particular work in this particular way, after the opening is over, of course. But the background, the situation that artists are placed in, all those really do come into play when you think about how they create. Being based in Japan, where I live, what sort of background I have, all those are like the context or the history. They're the hinterland of what I create. And when I spoke about D.T. Suzuki, Suzuki is translated and he can be read in English, which is really one part of why he is explained, why he is well known around the world. But there's so much which is attractive. I'm going to be doing a new work for Art Week Tokyo, but I'm going to be using Kayokyoku, which are Japanese popular songs. And we have been agonizing about how to communicate that. So this time it's going to be called Japanese vernacular pop music. There's so much which is so rich and which isn't that well known, but by broadening awareness of this, I hope that this will help to deepen understanding about our work. Thank you. Thank you. Well, there are many different kinds of artists. Mori-san and I, the major difference is the use of video and the ease of sending the work as data. In my work, I have really been grounded in one particular area, and I've continued to look at the themes which become more evident as you live here. So I wasn't really that active a participant in artist in residence programs, for example. But what I'm trying to aim for is to create a work which is going to have global appeal. Even though I might be placed in Okinawa, which is a small island, and my network is limited and very small, I want to link together with people and really do my best to boost the collaborative aspect as much as possible. Doing all of that has finally made it possible to see an increase in international Biennale and Triennale quite recently. But then the COVID-19 pandemic began, so I haven't really been able to take part in those international art festivals. And a great deal of my participation prior to that, 2017, 2018, for example, was in the Overhausen Short Films Festival. So I was primarily invited as a filmmaker, but I was able to get the funds to cover my travel costs. I was also invited to Jakarta in the same context, and I was able to go there. But in those cases, I was invited by the country which was acting as the host. Personally, I think that the Seoul Media City, the fact that I was able to get support from Japan in order to participate was really important for me. Also, this year I had an exhibition, solo show called Reframing, where the actual photographs were taken, or the actual shoot was taken or done under the pandemic situation. So everything was delayed. We also had to take the precautions that we'd never imagined. So the cost was about 50% even more expensive than normal, so 1.5% of my normal shooting budget. So the issue is, how do I make up the difference? I ate into my own savings, and it was a lot. Because I take the setup already of shooting a film. It's like making a real film, because I need to get a cinema crew. I need to have people who make props. I need to have a coordinator. It's gone beyond the scale of what an individual does. So there's the cost of paying for their airfare and their living costs. So if I am invited to take part in international Biennale, it's actually about 1/10 of what I need. Because if I could get more support to support the creative process, then I'd be able to expand on my collaboration, and the work would be enhanced even more in quality. So to be frank with you and to take up that invitation, what I really would like to see is support for the actual costs of making the work. I have survived up to now by funding my own work, but now that Japan is part of what my activity is going to be defined by, as the Japanese would say, it's like I'm shouldering a signboard which is visible to everybody from my back. But my work aims to become comparable with a feature film. I also intend to share my work not just through arts festivals, also through film festivals. I want to be able to have the resilience and the quality that will cut across those borders and boundaries. Also, when I do anything in a museum, I would take the setup of an immersive installation, usually a sound installation, but up to now, I have always done the editing so that everything can be reduced to a single channel, and then this can be shared with International Biennale and Triennale. And re-editing, all that process has been done previously by myself with no outside help. And if I could get more support for the costs of collaboration, then I would be able to dream the same dreams as other people. And I'd like to, this is just talking about my dream, but I'd like to really try out for the film festival. Thank you for that very direct appeal about needing 2 more digits. We also have some questions we also have the ability to receive questions from the audience, but Before that, I'd like to ask the panelists to say a few words.
The art platform project is to continue until the next fiscal year, and that will be the end of that project. We have created this website, and we would like to see how that website can be used, not just from Japan, but from outside of Japan as well. And I'd like to ask each one of you as to what needs do you see for the promotion of this website. Well, it's been 3.5 years, and now we are in the 4th year, and we had been engaged in the platform project, and I think we have shown some outputs from our involvement. For example, with this website that's been created, it's important how this website can be utilized throughout the world. Because we did start this website, and we think that it is designed in such a way that it can be used very widely. Of course, we have done a lot of PR activities to encourage people to use this, but we want to see how it can be utilized more fully. Once we do have such abundance of data through the website, I think this can be very helpful for researchers. But the data that we have gathered for the website, it's possible that after 10 years, 20 years, will no longer be available after some time has elapsed. So we want to see that we will be able to continue the website, and that we'll try to update the data that's captured on the database. And as a database, for creating the database, we have to gather the data in a very a fair manner, and no discrimination against any sort of information that's gathered. And we want to see how that can be utilized for different purposes, for research, for critique. And so we will not be placing any values to the data we gathered. Now, in the art platform, there are certain translated past publications which have done some ratings or ranking of data that's been captured in such a volume. So you will find some of that value attached to the data. Well, we just started this, and it is not, we don't have that large volume of data. So what we need to do first is to enrich the database, and that this should be regarded as a unique source of data. And it can be used for education purposes. It can be used by college libraries. And we need this to be known so that if people are looking for the data, that they can suggest this website for that purpose. We hope that that's how the database will be used. Right now, I think it's mostly for curators and researchers, but we also want this to be viewed by the audience. Also, artists should be active users of the database, and we hope that this could be food for any further creations that the artists will be creating. Well, the question to the two artists with the Media City Seoul and the Sao Paulo Biennales, may I ask you how the offers for you to take part came to you? Who connected you to that? Or how were you discovered? Well, there is what's called Japan House in Sao Paulo. And I was to exhibit there, And there's a curator by the name of Sasha who said that maybe we should get Mori for the Biennale. So it was through the Japan House exhibit meeting that they offered me also a place in the Sao Paulo Biennale. In my case, in 2019, here at the National Art Center, I showed Shinbi Western. And at that time, Ms. Uematsu Yuka and an art director by the name of Yuma, and they were looking for an artist for their project. And they were suggesting that they come look at mine. And the gallery also then researched some of my past works, and that's how they contacted me. Well, you must have been very happy to be approached in such a way. The people who take part in the workshops, they are usually people who are planning biennales in the pursuant years. So when they were taking part in the workshop, they also went to visit the Japanese artists who could be candidates for their show. So I think you were quite very fortunate. It had been very fortunate for you to be discovered. Ms. Mori-san, you spoke about a Japan House. And for Japanese contemporary art to be exhibited outside of Japan, there's a question as to how you could exhibit outside. I understand that Japan House is located in several countries. Yes, Japan House is currently exhibiting right now, and it could be not just contemporary art, some designs or some traditional crafts as well. So Japan art is involved not just in contemporary art, but I think they were quite powerful in exhibiting such a contemporary art. And we may have some questions from the floor. Thank you. And listening to this symposium, I'm very happy. And I've spoken to people from the Agency of Cultural Affairs, and I know that there's a lot of ideas, some but which have not been put into actual execution or implementation. But I've heard that a lot of these ideas are now being put into actual implementation, and I'm very happy to hear that. And I think I have already touched upon a lot of issues, but there are some which I had thought that was lacking in your discussion. One concerns education, and I really don't know what's going on, what sort of education goes on in Japan. Maybe in the last 10 years or so, finally we are finding contemporary art being discussed in the school textbooks for high schools. And until that time, it was only the Impressionists, for example, which had been discussed in school. So I'd like to ask someone to respond to this question about education and contemporary art. And today we had Hirayama-san from Bunka-cho today. And she explained to us what Bunka-cho is doing. And if I was wondering if something like this were possible, and I have difficulty in speaking to different sections of Bunka-cho, but what I'm suggesting is that could you have a separate division or section within Bunka-cho or agency for contemporary art, because then they could be the division or department that is going to be responsible for that. And we're talking about advancement of contemporary art today. I think that this could be a very good way of doing that.
Thank you. Now, contemporary art and education. Kajiya-san, you're a professor, sir. You're an educator. Well, first of all, art history education. There are many universities with teachers who are specialists in art history. However, those whose specific area of concentration is contemporary art is still very limited. There may be some universities which have that capability. In my case, there's myself and Hoshino Hitoshi who do provide some coverage. And there are other educators, professors who are able to cover the situation in other periods preceding contemporary art. We actually have some real art classes where people get to make work from this fiscal year. So this is an ability part of merging art and science in an organic way, and contemporary art is being experienced by many different students who come from many different specialties. There's also, of course, the Tokyo University of the Arts, which has GAP, which is about global art practice. And they have the global art and education. And I think that it's... I think that's about it. And the second question, Hirayama-san, could you respond? So, it starts with the question of what exactly is contemporary art. When we discussed the vitalization of the art market, then we had a question of what about music, what about film? Is that included or not? Because video-based work could be considered as film, not just as fine art. And art is so broad. When the word art was imported as Japan began to modernize, it was geijutsu, which is the artistic, and then became bijutsu, which is more about the aesthetics. And then that is what corresponds to the fine arts. So the fine arts, or the visual arts in this, the visual arts primarily, in this case, is the starting point, but it's so broad, it also means that we really have to question ourselves about how far do the lines of demarcation come. Also, the Agency for Cultural Affairs has a division which supports creativity, which means the performing arts, music, and the visual arts. So anything which is considered to be artistic endeavor can be supported. Our thought is that everything interacts. It's not just something which you can say has a cut-off point, which might be necessary when you think about the actual practicalities of making things. But when you think about the support for the artists, we need to take a broader context into consideration. What we really need is about 1,000 more civil servants who are assigned to the Agency for Cultural Affairs. And then we would be able to have a proper framework for supporting music and the film, or whatever. which we can't do right now, but right now we are focusing on supporting the creators, and we have created about 3 different organizations to do that, and we provide extend support. And there could be paintings, installations. Ideally, I would like to see a separate division which focuses just on that kind of contemporary art. Hirayama-san, there's another question that I'd like to ask you while you're here. We had the opportunity to have the midpoint update report, and there are various points that you emphasize. The art platform initiative is supported until next fiscal year. Could you tell us about what happens after this? Well, strengthening the functions of national art museums through the national through the communication center is something that I emphasized. And as for the clarifying how we actually see the international debate, we also have discussion going on about how it would be really, really wonderful if we could have one organization and a mechanism for supporting and boosting the arts, like an arts foundation. Not just with museums, but if we start off by making an organization from scratch, it's going to be difficult. But having the National Art Museum, or the National Art Center in this case, providing us with a kernel of that is really helping us. And we'd like to ask for your continued support for the art platform. We have budget, and you have autonomy. And so it's up to Director Osaka and all of you to continue with discussion. Thank you. Any other questions from the floor? Any questions from... there's a question from a member of the audience. Yamashiro-san, Mori-san, you have taken part in some famous international Biennale. If we try to create an international Biennale, which is going to attract a great deal of attention and participation from around the world, what kind of event would you like to see in order to make sure that we don't have just Mark II of the Venice Biennale? Uematsu-san? Creating a new Biennale, original, we already do have them. We already have those art Triennale and Biennale. For example, Kataoka-san is going to be involved with Aichi. There's also Yokohama. There's also Setouchi. There are a number of Biennale and Triennale. So there's a question of whether we are identifying aspects which are different from Venice, and whether we are looking at things which are distinctively Japanese. The distinctly Japanese, I don't really quite get the context of how that phrase came up in the Japanese kind of festival, so I'm afraid this is as far as I can go. And if I could add to that, Venice is the oldest international art festival. It's almost like the Olympic Games because it's not really just focused on Venice. So the locality and the history of Venice is not really an integral part of the Venice Biennale. It's really an international cosmopolitan event. So creating something like that in Japan is very difficult. Also, the historical background is so different, I don't think the context is quite the same. However, looking at the international Biennale and Triennale, which are organized in Japan, trying to showcase all of Japanese culture is quite ambitious. But looking at Aichi, Aichi Triennale is focusing on the history of the area, of the different locations where the Triennale is being held, and we have this attempt to open up a discussion, a debate between the work of the artists who come from abroad and who we are. And there is currently about 300 or so international art festivals in the regions around Japan. So whether there's a need to create another one is a question that we have to look at. Also, there's the other issue that Yuko Uematsuka mentioned of where do we identify the originality.
Any further questions from the floor? Yes, we have the gentleman in the first row. I'm from Asahi newspaper. My name is Ono. I'm from the cultural desk. And as a future issue for the platform business project, I think you want the database to be more widely used is something that all of you have mentioned. And how would you evaluate the fact that the database is actually being utilized or not? Or whether they are cited in researches, or how is it the level of the usage by the media? Is that how you would measure the utilization or successful utilization of the website or database? Do you have any measure of how that's being used? Mr. Nariai? Well, I have not felt that is being used very widely yet, and I can only try to appeal to the public, to the users in a forum like this. And as to the content of the database or the translations, perhaps more for curators and researchers, or they tend to be more for the professionals, and that is a criticism or that I have received. But the way that person is looking at is how that there are the experts, professionals, as opposed to the general audience. But it's possible that there are people who may not be the experts or professionals, but do have a very broad and or extensive knowledge. So I'm sure there are people who are potential users of the database, and we're hoping to be able to reach such people. And I think we have to get this database be freed from the concept that it is only made for the researchers and professionals or experts. And while we have not really seen or felt the broad usage yet, we'd like to see it used more widely. I think there are several databases of various Japanese culture assets. Have you had any discussions as to incorporate some of that into Shuzo in the future? Well, as to linkage, I think Ms. Kawachi has more experience in the linkage of the databases. We want to connect to Japan Search and also the cultural asset online, which I mentioned earlier. And I want to see how we can then, well, we are looking at ways of being able to incorporate some of these data also into the art platform. And Takahashi-san, you have a question? Thank you very much. I have seen that the website is already open and that I hope that this will be used very widely. There are the two things that I have felt. The one thing that I'd like to say on the representing galleries, for example, museums might have their personnel, they have budgets, but if they could provide more support to artists themselves, which the artists have the liberty of using it in the way they want to. For example, if we are finding that there might be catalog of work that is published by the outside world. Sometimes we find that sometimes these are not authorized by the artists themselves, or that they had not been proper translations. And if we could have some support or subsidy for these translations, I think this will be very helpful in having the artists represented overseas. And I know that this project is coming to an end in the next fiscal year. And something I'd like to ask about preservation of the artworks or repairing them, because if they are circulated in exhibits overseas, I think artists would need maybe a dedicated team for that purpose, or maybe you need to have some sort of a platform for that. So that was not a question, right? Just a comment. And I also have some final question from the audience. And this art platform project will end next year. But I understand that many of the projects are very long-term projects, so that you will not be able to see an immediate impact of the project. But what will be the future of the project? And while this project is going to end next year, I understand that this will be then handed over to the coming or the future projects, and I hope that we'll be able to have discussions. So at the end of the 5 years, instead of just judging the result of the project, we have to see how this could be maintained in a sustainable manner to her future projects. The database that we've put together, or gathering the existing volumes and texts and translating them. That is a very cumbersome work, and it takes a lot of effort to do this. And this is not something that someone the private sector can do on their own. The fact that the Bunka-cho is doing this, and of course holding major art events might seem to be a tangible result of our activities, but the fact that we are funding, or the Bunka-cho is funding these attempts of putting together the database translation, I think this is going to then result in representing Japan more broadly outside of Japan. And the creation of network is being made, and then we found that as a result of that networking, we have seen these two artists being represented in exhibits outside. And I think that all of these endeavors and attempts will continue into the future for a better assessment of what the project has been able to do. Well, I'm sorry that we've gone over by 2 minutes or so, but this brings us to the closing of this symposium. We had translations by Ms. Yokota Kayako and Kobayashi Akiko. And this session has been captured by Aoyama Shinya and his video team for the filming and also distribution of this symposium today. I'd like to thank all the people who had been helpful and cooperative in creating this symposium and making it possible. Thank you very much for your interest, and thank you for staying with us until the end of the symposium.